Hey, well, welcome to In Rhythm's Introduction to Regenerative Organizations. I'm Jen Cates with the In Rhythm team. Thanks for joining us. We hope that you come away from this time together with a better understanding of designing organizations and social systems in a more regenerative way. It's great to see all of you. Encourage you all to stay on video if possible. I definitely understand if there's a connectivity issue and you need to stay off it video, then I get that too. But please engage in the chat. If you are not familiar with In Rhythm, we are a design and management firm that focuses on revealing potential in individuals, teams, networks, and communities all over the world. Our intention is to do this through a living systems approach. We offer lots of tools, and a lot of them are free that you can check out on our website. We have other webinars, online courses, design labs, and I'm more than happy to talk with you at a later time if that's possible, or connect with you over email. Before we get started, I would like to introduce you to Alex Groom-Clement. Alex is an integral part of the In Rhythm team as our Director of Operations. I don't know if any of you has ever been wowed by someone who can multitask and execute on so many things, but Alex is definitely that person, and she makes it look so easy, and she does it with a smile on her face, and she's amazing. So she's going to be presenting today, and I'm lucky to work with her and see her almost every day, and I love it. So Alex, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you, Jen. That's a really sweet introduction. Really excited to be here with you and with everyone who's taking the time out of their day to spend it with us. Really grateful. It's really nice to meet you all. Lots of new faces here, some familiar. So hello to those who have joined us on other things before. I see David, good to see you, and Tracy. But yeah, thank you all for being here. I'm really excited. I've learned so much over the last few years since I joined the In Rhythm team. I'm originally from, I'll share a little bit about myself, but just briefly. So I grew up in Montreal, but now I'm actually kind of nomadic now. My husband and I put our stuff into storage and are spending time with family in different places as well. We have flexibility, so we're very fortunate to be able to do that. So I'm in Houston right now, not too far from some who have been letting us know where they're calling in from today. But really got into this work through a deep desire to support others and organizations and people and communities, and kind of a transformation to take a different approach. I spent many years working in the nonprofit industry and just felt like our ability to work together in a different way was one of our biggest barriers to have an impact that we wanted to in the world. And so that really inspired me to search for alternative approaches, and that's kind of what brought me to In Rhythm. So I'm really excited to share a little bit more about In Rhythm's approach today and give you a taste for it. And I just invite you all, like Jen said, participate in the chat. For those here who, I see Tracy, who's our marketing partner, and then Jen, of course, feel free to jump in if there's anything you want to add, or anyone else at any time. We have a fairly small group today, so we can make this more interactive. So we'll call out opportunities to do that. But if ever you want to just jump in and share, please feel free. This is pretty chill, open space. And one other thing, I guess, before we dive in, I just wanted to acknowledge the times. And I know, everyone's experiencing, COVID and the pandemic a little bit, the impacts of that a little bit differently. And I know it's a challenging time for many that might, maybe experiencing loss. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that. And yeah, I think it's just quite the time that we're going through. So we are here to support if you need anything. But with that, let's just dive in and talk about how we can regenerate potential in our organizations and the ecosystems that we're a part of, because it's needed now more than ever. Okay, we kind of started going through this, but what we're going to do today, we're going to talk a little bit about the state of organizations. We'll talk about a new metaphor. I'll introduce In Rhythm's design approach, and then we can have some discussion. Ooh, hello, St. Paul, Minnesota. I usually live there. Thank you for joining. Yeah, we'll make this interactive, jump in, participate in the chat, and we'll have plenty of time for discussion at the end. Some amazing folks here on this call, so I hope that you'll be able to stick around. So I'll start with a question. What is the most dominant metaphor to use to describe the organizations of today? So when you think about organizations, what's the first word that comes to mind? When you think about companies, teams, tell me what words come to mind for you. Yeah, organizations in general, like what is the dominant metaphor? Mechanistics, yeah, extractive, inequality, machines, yes, disjointed, dysfunctional. Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of us experience bureaucratic. Yeah, a lot of our organizations are designed in all of those ways. So thank you. And we put an emphasis and we focus on discovering and identifying these metaphors because metaphors have hidden assumptions about our worldviews. They shape how we think, and they have influence on how we make decisions. And so they really permeate the culture. And so when you begin to pay attention to this metaphor, you'll begin to see it everywhere. And they're very important in terms of creating change. It's because we begin to recognize them and create that shift even in our everyday language. But yeah, logistics, hierarchical. And so here at In Rhythm, we really recognize that the dominant metaphor across all industries is the machine. So these are results from some Google searches. Yes, I did say shifts, Justin, feel free to post about that. So yes, the dominant metaphor is recognizing that our organizations are most often designed after machines. So on the left, results from a quick Google search. This is your business as a machine with all these cogs and gears working together with profit coming through the bottom. And in the middle is from Inc. magazine, a very popular magazine in North America. 5 ways to run your company like a well-oiled machine. Can't tell me the metaphor is not prevalent when you see that. And then on the right is something pulled from McKinsey's website. They talk about leadership factories, so producing leaders through a factory model. So you can really see that this machine metaphor is super prevalent in how we talk about our organizations and how we train people how to design organizations and manage them. We also think of our schools and our economies and our broader systems in this way. So you can see on the right, there's this kind of factory thing going on. It's a comic, and they're producing students through this machine that is the school system, right? And then on the left is talking about the state of Georgia in the United States, the state of Georgia and its economic engine, right? And if you think back to the school model, schools are really all about performing for someone else's approval. Somebody else is in control, the machine operator, and that person, the teacher, maybe has all the answers. And I think schools are starting to shift, but predominantly, that's really been the model, right? And we get treated as if we're the same. We're not unique. We're kind of just coming out of this system. And we even think of our human bodies as a machine. On the right is this image of the human body and comparing it to different components of a machine from the back in the 20th century. In the middle, we've got a reset button on a brain. How many of us talk about our brains in this way? Oh, I'm hardwired. I just need to reboot or rewire my brain. Or we even talk about ourselves as driven and burnt out. So it's super prominent. Even business leader Ray Dalio, he's kind of the founder of Bridgewater Associates, and so very prominent business leader in the States. He talks about thinking of yourself as a machine operating within a machine, aka the organization, and know that you have the ability to alter your machines to produce better outcomes. So it's just prevalent everywhere. How many of you have used one of these idioms before, right? Burnout, driven, hardwired. Type in the chat if you can think of others. And so we ask ourselves, therefore, if the dominant metaphor is the machine, what are the consequences of treating organizations as machines and therefore people as parts? What do you think? What do you think are the consequences of that? What's happening in society, in our lives? Feel free to type in the chat. Dehumanization. Yeah, absolutely. And so emotionless approach, depression, crash and burn, all of those things, feeling like a cog in the machine, a degradation to life. Yes, these are all consequences of treating our organizations as machines. And so at In Rhythm, we really recognize that if we look at the outcomes of this on a meta level and we look at our organizations as a whole, from our governments to our nonprofits to our for-profits, this is not resulting in great outcomes for the planet, right? This is one example of that. It's the Living Planet Index that indicates global biodiversity has been decreasing, and it's a direct result of human impact. So the systems we've designed are degrading the planet. And it hasn't been great for people either. Every year there's an organization in the States called Gallup, and they look at employee engagement. And in 2019, they found that only 36% of people were engaged at work. 36% of people only are engaged in their work, right? So the system's not working for people either. That's like 74% of people aren't engaged at work. That's wild. And this comes at a great cost to the economy. Actively disengaged employees are estimated to cost the US economy alone up to $450 billion to $550 billion in lost productivity every year. And then millennials, I'm a millennial, and we make up in the US 38% of the workforce, and some estimates indicate that we'll make up to 3/4 of the workforce by 2025. And we're one of the least engaged generations. So only 29% of millennials are engaged in their work. So clearly something isn't working about how we design organizations for future generations either. And then from an equality perspective, as a result of our current design, the top 10 billionaires in the world are richer than entire countries. Something isn't working when we look at it that way. And then from an equity perspective, from a racial and gender equity perspective, this same system is creating a ton of inequity. If you look at access to housing, jobs, what's happening in the criminal justice system, we know that race is still the greatest predictor of how well you're going to do in these systems and the access to resources that you have, particularly here in the States. And we recognize that this isn't by mistake, this is by design. And so this slide is courtesy of our partners at the Gemini Group. And they point out the laws in the United States that actually have constructed our society to favor white people and those at the top, and at the expense of immigrants, of African Americans, of others. So it was not a mistake. It is by design, and that system is not working for all. And so centuries of human development have led to governments that can't govern, economies that cannot economize, corporations that can't incorporate, schools that don't get the essence of learning, investments that don't leave the world better off, consumer goods that don't do good, and healthcare systems that don't care. So when we think back to the metaphors that we use that can shape and build our world, our language often lacks truthfulness. So this is credit of Lean Gorison, who wrote a great book called Building the Future of Innovation. And so here at In Rhythm, we see this as a design issue. On the one hand, it can be really disheartening to be like, oh, dang, like our systems are all collapsing and things are broken. But at the same time, it's a design issue. We've designed it this way and we can design it differently. But it's important to recognize kind of where this machine metaphor came from and how it was initially very empowering. So the machine metaphor was born out of the industrial era, and it enabled a shift towards kind of a more scientific, rational point of view. But unfortunately, that was dominated by prediction and control and cause and reflect. And so the belief at the time was that the world could be reduced to its parts in order to make sense of it, and that nature worked according to these mechanical laws. But we began to understand that so deeply and then apply it to all systems. So Newton and other thinkers, their laws were so convincing that we've been applying them to all human endeavors beyond kind of more science-based endeavors, even social ones. So yeah, I think it's just important to really recognize where this came from and that it was really empowering in the age of enlightenment. And it's served as the foundation for much of our civilization today. But even Einstein recognized the limitations of this approach, right? So he said, when the number of factors coming into play in a phenomenological complex is too large, the scientific method in most cases fails. One only need think of the weather, in which case the prediction, even for a few days ahead, is impossible. So what Einstein's calling out is that when we're dealing with complex systems and when we're dealing with complexity, we cannot predict and control the future, which is quite profound because, as we learned previously, what came out of the kind of the Enlightenment time is this metaphor, and we were applying it to everything. But even thinkers like Einstein are recognizing, no, that does not work. We can't predict or control complex systems. And this diagram is a really great way to think about that. So most people don't understand the distinctions between complicated and complex things. So in complicated systems, there's a series of inputs and steps, and you can get predictable outcomes. So that might be putting together a set of IKEA furniture, right? So, your box arrives at your door, there's a bunch of different parts, you have instructions, and you can put it together. It can be very frustrating to put together, but you can do it. And you'll usually get what you intend to. And then there's complex systems. Complex systems are very different. So there's dense interdependencies. When change happens, it's nonlinear. There's a lot of unknowns. And we actually can't predict or control the outcomes because there's so many factors and they're so interrelated. And so we talk about complicated being things that we make and complex being things that we manage. And I think it's important to spend time on this because some of the most significant challenges that we face today as leaders is really, they're complex in nature. And human beings really have a tendency to want to apply a complicated approach to everything. We want to simplify, we want it to be the quickest route possible. But in reality, most of the challenges that we face when you think of our social environment, our organizations, our teams, transforming organizational culture, food security, climate change, our bodies, these are all complex entities, and we can't just apply a series of known steps to get the same outcomes. Each of us are unique, each of us are different. And so we can't confuse the two. It's important to know which approach to take in which situations. And it's not like one is worse or better than the other, it's just different situations. And so just to really hit the point home, when you think about these two things, is that complex or complicated? Feel free to type in the chat. Not a trick question. Complicated, yes. And these, complex or complicated? Complex, yes. So there's growing recognition that systems are complex. There's change happening all over the world. We're recognizing that healthcare organizations are complex. We're recognizing that schools are complex. And here at In Rhythm, we believe we're in the middle of another shift in perception. And it's not going to be known as the digital age or the Facebook age or the millennial age, and hopefully not the COVID age either. This is going to be known as the age of complexity. And we're going to be characterized as the generation of whether or not we figured out how to really work with and manage for complexity. And so here at In Rhythm, we recognize that we need new models and new metaphors. This machine metaphor isn't serving us, and we need to turn to a different model for different inspiration on how we can work with complexity. And so nature has 3.8 billion years of experience. We are a part of nature. We are one with nature. And so we look to life as a metaphor. And living systems have these unique characteristics that enable us to work in complexity that the machine systems don't. And so what can we learn? Now, we don't just point to any model of life like the circle of life, because of course, life in reality isn't all singing lions and warthogs and meerkats, unfortunately, much to my dismay. Growing up as a Lion King lover, I was disappointed to hear that wasn't the case. So we don't just look to any model of life. Actually, we look at a systems view of life. And so In Rhythm's work is really based on science that came out of Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela from the Santiago School in Chile. And they really were the first to taking a holistic or systems approach to studying what is life. And so this has really informed the basis of In Rhythm's work. And we go into a lot of depth about this in our Foundations of Regenerative Organizations online course. And maybe we'll share more about that later, Jen, just to give folks a heads up if they're interested in learning more. So definitely worth looking into. Systems View of Life is actually a whole textbook, and there's some incredible science and research in there about what is life. But in really brief, what is life in 60 seconds? So life is an organized system capable of maintaining itself within a boundary of its own making. So really, this is a defining aspect of what life is for us and what we design to here at In Rhythm. It really means that living systems are regenerative, and regenerative is living. And so, all right, you must be wondering, how are we using this systems view of life to design organizations? So to recap on what we've learned so far, when we apply a machine design to organizations, we tend to engineer best practices. And when we design with these best practices in mind, this reinforces prescriptive structures. So, an example of that might be, so if we're applying best practices to an organization, that's like, this has worked here, so we need to apply that same thing in our organization. Or that business model worked in Google, oh, that same business model worked for me. And that enforces prescriptive structures, which actually degenerates the health of the system and requires, oh, wait, I'll come to that after. And then if we take a living systems design, recognizing that organizations are living systems full of potential waiting to be released, living systems design informs a principle-based approach. And that principle-based approach allows us to facilitate using flexible frameworks, flexible design frameworks, and then that actually regenerates the health
fire back in the
of
room
the
because it has a
system.
smell.
Oh, I think there's someone that needs to mute. Sorry, guys, getting some background noise. Thank you. So yeah, a principle-based approach using flexible frameworks regenerates the health of the system. And so when we use a mechanistic design on our organizations, it takes more energy. It takes more energy to do that. It's exhausting, it's frustrating, and it requires more external inputs. Whereas when we take a living systems design to working with our organizations, it takes less energy and it creates the conditions for the organization to self-maintain and self-regenerate. And it's in all of this, really what's core to In Rhythm's work is supporting shifts in perspectives and in operations. We recognize that this is not an easy shift to make. We've spent generations designing organizations as machines, taking an approach that might be informed by best practices, prescribing structures that we find elsewhere. But we've found through our work in many, many years is that this design frees up more energy in teams and creates the condition for even more potential to emerge from the system. And that takes time and shifts in perspectives in operations. And just to kind of reiterate that it's not that a machine design or a living systems design is one better than the other. It's actually just where we apply it. Like, I wouldn't want to receive a set of IKEA furniture with some principles and flexible frameworks to set that up. I would actually much rather receive some best practices and some ways that it's determined to put it together. Otherwise, it would be very frustrating. So it's not that one's good or bad. It's just things that we make versus things that we manage. So a little bit about what we mean by each. So In Rhythm has kind of designed to regenerative design principles. And we have 6 principles that we've chosen that are inspired by the systems view of life and by how life works. And there's for those of you who might be familiar with the regenerative design space, there's a lot of different sets of principles out there. And this is just the ones we've chosen to design to that are meaningful in our context and for the folks that we work with. And so I'll run through them quickly. They're in no particular order. So the first is holism. That's recognizing that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The second is interdependence, inherent value of all relationships. So that's really recognizing that, we have these complex interdependencies with our clients, with our customers, with our partners, and sometimes even with our competitors. And then there's uniqueness. That's recognizing the originality and the possibility of genius and designing around that in each person. So each person in our organization is unique, and we bring something unique, and how can we design around that? And similarly, our organizations are unique, and how do we figure out what that uniqueness is and design with that in mind as a part of the greater system? The fourth is evolutionary. So that's all about, evolutionary, I feel like, is the most relevant one for many of us in the last year. Is how do we respond and adapt and remain flexible in a changing environment? When COVID hit, so many organizations had to pivot super fast and change their business model, their annual plans. Evolutionary is a really critical principle to design to, when, especially in today's world, and that's constantly changing. And then the fifth is nodal, decentralized and distributed. Nodal is, think of a networked versus a hub and spoke. So instead of relying on centralized command and control structures, it's all about having distributed decision making, allowing everyone in the system to be empowered resource decision makers. If you've ever been the founder of a company and working with a team, but feeling like all the stress and pressures on you, imagine that could be distributed among the whole system. There's all kinds of cool ways to design with that principle in mind. And then lastly, developmental. It's about the growth and health of the members of the system. So that's all about creating the conditions for ourselves to grow and develop, but in conjunction with the system or organization that we're a part of in order to create health. So even Buckminster Fuller recognized, Buckminster Fuller is an amazing human. He is a futurist, systems thinker, author, designer, inventor, and here in the States. And he said, work with life-centered principles and the universe pitches in to help. And so with living systems principles, we facilitate working with flexible frameworks. And so what we recognize is that we need different ways, right? So what happens when we apply principles to complicated systems, right? So imagine I get my set of IKEA furniture with a set of principles, it must stand to design to. I would be very frustrated. And similarly, when we apply sets of instructions or best practices to complex systems, that also leads to frustration. People aren't machines, and treating our people like they're cogs in a machine just leads to frustration, burnout, all of those things that you all mentioned earlier. So we recognize that we need a new kind of framework to manage complexity. And so InRhythm has created a regenerative framework. It's a design framework or a design process, and it's how we work with complexity. And I've, been working with this for about 3 years now. We go into a lot more depth about this in our Foundations of Regenerative Organizations course, so I won't go into it in too much depth right now. But I think what I'll call out, and actually if Jen and Tracy want to jump in after as well, you can feel free. But I think the biggest thing that I wanted to mention about this framework is that it's about creating the conditions for health. So, most organizations tend to say, okay, let's develop our strategic plans. We're going to develop all these products and programs, and that's going to support our business model. But very few organizations take the time to create the conditions for health, structures to enable that health. So things like designing our roles and responsibilities first to create the conditions for health, and then to serve as a platform to do the things we want to do together. So it's a very different approach to organizational design and management. And part of it too is that everyone is a decision maker and plays a role in the design. So kind of in some ways, everyone becomes a designer, and we're empowered to influence and change and adapt. And every day with every decision that we make, we're creating and recreating our organizational context. So that's just a little bit about the framework. Jen, do you want to speak to anything? If you're there, I can't see anyone.
That's okay. I was just replying to someone on chat, but I really appreciate the essence of the framework and how it all comes back to health. And we are all complex systems for sure. And if the health of the system is not working, then I think all of these other structures and everything else degenerate. So it's nice to see how this all fits in together, how it's interconnected.
Thanks. Yeah. I'm surprised that you didn't call out abundance.
I know. I thought about it. I'm usually all about that abundance.
Yeah. Yeah. And abundance is really, our aspirations. If we can embrace the idea that we cannot predict and control what happens in our organizations, if we embrace what might be emergent outcomes instead of trying to predict and control, then abundance and resilience become a recurring outcome of the design. And so, part of the challenge with managing complexity is that we don't know the outcome. And so how do you embrace the uncertainty and kind of with your team? And so it's all about creating the conditions for health. So I hope that provides a little bit of a taste for InRhythm's framework, and we can talk more about that later if anyone's interested. All right, so these frameworks actually regenerate the health of a system, like I said. And then lastly, it's all about creating the shifts in perspectives and in operations. So we talk about shifting from best practices to principles, from prescriptions to responsive frameworks, from dominance to interdependence. We talk about shifting from prediction to pattern, so creating the conditions for health and emergence, from extraction to equity, where people are the energy source of the organizations, developing the whole versus the few, and from centralized power to decentralized empowerment, where everybody is a decision maker and it's not reliant upon one. And so this is our living, evolving definition of what a regenerative organization is. And so we say a regenerative organization is a living, evolving, and naturally functioning organization where abundance and resilience are recurring outcomes of its underlying health. And systems thinker Danella Meadows, she once wrote that the world is a complex, interconnected, finite, ecological, social, psychological, and economic system. We treat it as if it were not, as if it were divisible, separable, simple, and infinite. Our persistent, intractable global problems arise directly from this mismatch. And so with that, we just wanted to open it up with a question, and then we can kind of stop the screen share and go into discussion, but just want to know what is shifting for you today. Would love to hear from folks. And yeah, thank you. Feel free to jump in on audio or type questions in the chat. But that kind of concludes the formal presentation part of this. And anyone who wants to stick around to discuss, would love to hear. Justin says lots of things are shifting. Justin, if you want to share a little bit, would love to hear if you're willing.
I was just thinking about, actually, it was a comment that Justin made earlier about education, and then the slide that you put up, Alex, of education and how the essence of learning may not be, or it could be lost. And I mean, just imagine if a true essence of learning was nurtured in an environment of learning, just how that takes you through the rest of your life. Anyway, I was just thinking about ways how that can be better.
It's funny, I was speaking with a friend who, I think during COVID, lots of parents have had their kids at home, right? And a friend was talking about how, the teachers will send her son home with all kinds of homework, and they're like, just follow these steps and you'll get the right answers. And so here she is trying to teach these concepts, and the prescribed best practices to get her son to the right answer aren't working. And she's like, oh my gosh, you can't apply a complicated approach to this complex, challenge of education of your kids. And I think there's probably some parents on this call. If anyone wants to jump in and speak to that too, I think it would be cool to hear.
I definitely was, that for some reason that stuck out to me too, Jen. When you like just seeing the machine illustration, because I always look at it from a business standpoint, but I'm starting, like, my son's going to be going into, like, he's in preschool, but he's going to be going into the system, maybe, I don't know. And I look at that and I'm like, oh my gosh, I do not want to send him into that, because my experience was, it's like you learn how to, these prescribed things, and they take all the creativity out of you. I mean, everybody knows like what most of our public schools are like, but to your point, Jen, the nurturing part of it, where it's kind of like allowing the children to, inform what's actually going on in the classroom, would just be, and I know there's wonderful teachers out in the world, but at large, that's a scary thing to send your child into a program like that, after you've worked for, like for their first few years to, encourage their intuition and their creativity. And then like what happens when you send them into that environment, and then it perpetuates, obviously.
Yeah.
So that got me too today for some reason.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of my biggest unlearnings has been, I feel like what I learned in many ways at school, and I think school was still really valuable to me in that form, because I think it's informed everything that I've done up until now, and, no regrets. But this, in inner belief that the answer is in other people, like the teacher has the answers, has carried forward in me in organizations, like, our managing director has all the answers. But actually there's really cool research coming out, and I know I see some hands up, but there's really cool research coming out about how our ability to manage complexity isn't necessarily made better with experience or expertise. It's about ways of thinking and being able to apply frameworks and different ways of thinking to solve complex challenges or work with complexity. It's not necessarily about our expertise or the depth of experience that we have, or having 40 years of experience. It actually, research shows, doesn't make you any better or worse, because complexity is so challenging to work with. Yeah.
Awesome. We do have a couple of hands up, I think. Hey, iPhone, you want to unmute?
Hi there.
Hi.
Are you talking to me?
Yes.
Hi. Thank you. Yes, I've been working in organizational settings my entire adult life, and I have been in very progressive situations. And what I had mentioned in the chat has come from seeing a pattern over a period of 20 years that within our organizations, we've actually tried to apply how you're defining a regenerative model, where we create, first off, ideal conditions for the participants of the organization to feel included and create a sense of ownership. And what we've seen time and time again is people not being able to step up to the plate of what that kind of ownership entails. They generally want to be told what to do. And that when you include them in decision making and create an environment that is participatory, it can even create resentment. And so I guess the question is, A, how do you address that? And B, how do you train folks who've learned mechanistic approaches to life to run what I call the adaptive algorithm, where the person who's busy doing what you might call mouse work can keep enough of that eagle vision that they can respond in a timely manner to changes that can affect the outcome of what we're aiming for. Big questions.
Love that question. What is your name, iPhone? Just as iPhone, would love to be able to know your name.
That's funny. I'm surprised. My name is Blair Phillips.
Blair. Okay. Thank you, Blair. So the first thing that came up for me, and I saw Tracy posted in the chat, so maybe she can chime in too. I think there tends to be, I totally have seen that challenge too. And so have we at End Rhythm. And I think the learning for me personally has been, involving everyone in every decision isn't the answer. Co-designing what a healthy decision-making structure is the key. So just by default, making everyone equal decision makers doesn't create health. Actually, to your point, it can create a lot of anxiety. It can actually degenerate health over time. But what does it look like? And maybe you've experienced this, so I'd be curious, Blair, maybe we can even talk more about it some other time. But when we co-create the decision-making structures of a team and we recognize that some people, they don't want to be making certain types of decisions, that's okay. And we co-design that, and we want decision-making structures to create health and not create anxiety, but recognizing that that can grow and evolve over time as well. There's nothing sacred about how it's first designed as a team. And Tracy actually has a great story about that I would love to invite her to share if she's willing.
Yeah, so we did the design lab at my organization, and our first inclination was everybody's equal. Let's all make the decisions together. And that didn't work. We slowly realized that was not health for our organization. And I love what Trey said last week, another one of the co-founders of In Rhythm, is when you look at nature and living systems, there is a hierarchy in living systems. Like if you look at a cow and like a baby calf, like there's a nurturing situation that's going on there. And so as a leader, how can you nurture the people that work in your organization? In some cases, it is empowering them to make certain decisions. In some cases, it actually creates a large amounts of anxiety for someone to be in that decision-making process. So, the first inclination was, again, everybody's equal. And then we kind of pulled back on that. And then we had deeper conversations, and not being afraid to, stop doing something at that moment, and that's the thing. It's like not getting caught in a new cog. It's like, okay, let's take a step back. That needs to die. Well, we won't do that again. But let's talk about what will work. And then that's where, having the conditions that create trust, and potentially communicate, like open communication, is where you can do that creation process that Alex is talking about, where you can just, constantly modify and create health, and knowing that that's going to be an ongoing process, and being open to that too. So.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I think there's a lot of validity to that in certain circumstances. But when you're in a environment where people are handed, well, first off, I want to completely agree in that creating the environment is the critical part, and definitely equality does not necessarily mean making all the decisions, but it does mean that when someone takes on a responsibility, that they need to be able to adapt and respond to changes that are on their table without other people. And that kind of ownership is a piece of what I was referring to. So if a task, someone from that ideal environment takes on a task and says, yes, I'm ready to do this, and then in all reality, when they make motion towards it and something changes, the left field ball gets thrown, they, from a classic model, have a real hard time not come running for help or needing hand holding through every step of micromanagement. And so there's a real dysfunction when it comes to people not being able to run the algorithm and being able to essentially step to what you're talking about as far as approaching organization and tasks from a regenerative model. That's kind of what needs to be addressed first for the people who are coming to these organizations, who are coming out of, traditional schooling.
It's building that capacity. It's giving people the opportunity to experience the shifts for themselves, right? And
exactly,
it's not something you can like manufacture for people, right? Because it's an aha moment. It's you coming to conclusions about what's shifting in your own life and your own experience within your organization, right? And that's what creates transformation. And I see David has his hand up. David does amazing work with people and helping transformation. So I'm curious, David, if you want to hop in.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking through what Blair brought up, and in general in these systems, the distribution of power. I think power I haven't heard used much in the conversation yet. And I think power awareness is critical to have a self-reflective way to know where you stand in relation to a particular context. Am I in a one-up position now? Am I in a one-down position? And what's the right relationship to that moment? Like, how can I take responsibility and be vulnerable and be in that empowered state? And how do I resource myself when I'm not used to that? And even our nervous systems have to catch up to that, because we get nervous and we start to go into fight or flight and we lose all our creative capacity. So it's kind of a complex adjustment for people to step into that form of leadership that's that hypermobile and can be in power positions when we're not used to that.
Mhm.
So I think that's part of the stretch for anybody in these systems.
Exactly.
Cool. There was a question that Ruth brought up in the chat a while back. What is the starting point if I was a member of an organization that wants to encourage other members to incorporate this approach? So Alex or anyone that's on the call want to jump in?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in, and then I'm sure others here have thoughts too based on their experience, so feel free to jump in. But I mean, in terms of a starting point for you wanting to get others involved in this work, I think there's incredible resources out there among, the different organizations who are supporting a regenerative approach. So for instance, webinars like this are a great way just to begin planting seeds. And Rhythm has many workbooks. I know there's many other resources out there from others that really start to give people a taste of a different approach. I kind of see it as planting little seeds. When, I have team members who share, we've worked with teams before and folks who might want to just kind of share a little bit about what you're learning in these webinars. Just say, hey, I attended this webinar and here's what I learned and here's how I think it could apply. And is that something that resonates? So just approaching the whole thing with a curiosity. And so that's been something that I've found has worked really well in my own approach to kind of change and working with people. But I'm sure some other folks here have ideas too that I'd love to invite them to share.
I actually think Ruth answered her own question when she said internal transformation creates conditions to transform external. So, yeah. Anyone
What
else?
I see happen a lot is people see the types of organizations that we're describing here and are super inspired and want a piece of it. I mean, you can kind of look at it in a way, like as an analogy, when I don't know, you go to see good music and there's that guy in the crowd who thinks he should be up on stage too. And he jumps up there and actually it's really distracted because he hasn't put in the time and self-awareness to be able to present for everybody else. And yeah, I just wonder how we can best kind of usher that awesome energy and that is inspired and heartfelt into the complex system that you're describing, when they just don't have the experience or education, but they're full of the heart.
Yeah. I think co-designing what that looks like for your context. I don't know that there's one size fits all, to say that there's one approach, one remedy to that. It's almost like it's so unique based on the people that are a part of each system. And so how do you create an environment, create a context in which everyone can work and operate and thrive, and that can evolve. But that context, because it's co-created, is something you all strive to create and recreate and live into together. And so, maybe there's aspects of what you choose as your like behaviors or values to live into together and refer back to that. Like one of my biggest learnings is like that, what's traditionally vision and mission or values for us is kind of this organizational context, but how do you not let it become something that's just on the wall? It's actually your culture, and you refer back to it for all the decisions that you make. And I think the key is using frameworks and coming back to it as a decision-making tool, and referring to, if you're wanting to take a regenerative approach or a living systems approach, utilizing the regenerative design principles every day. Like how could that decision that I made have been more nodal or more developmental, or how could this program shift in light of regenerative design principles? So I don't know. There was a question from Michelle that I did not understand. Do you have the qualifications for the teams that you work with?
Yes, I was just curious, if a team comes to you and says, we would love to work with you and we're really excited about this regenerative organization, do you have like a set of preconditioned qualifications that team has to be able to commit to work with you? Or do you say anyone who comes to you, you're willing to work with them?
That's a really good question. So I wouldn't say there's any one set of defined qualifications. It's really context specific. I think
Maybe commitments or
one of the pitfalls is that not all the decision makers in the current system are on board with the idea. So I think that would be defined as a qualification, in that, okay, all the decision makers need to be on board with going through a transformation. It can't be, a couple of people and then, okay, the guy who's actually in charge is just gonna, come and destroy the whole thing because he makes the final say. So it's having all the right people on board before we begin. But because we do so many different things, like we have the foundations course, the design lab, we generally offer, those are very accessible options for people wanting to take this approach. And so there does tend to be more folks participating in those areas than those that we work with, say, in one-on-one consulting. Those are definitely deeper, longer term relationships. And it just depends on the context. But Jen, is there anything you'd want to add to that?
No, I'm fine. I was just chatting with in the chat. But thank you guys. I know some of you have to run, and we just appreciate you guys spending time with us. And if you need more information, of course, we're here to help. And like was mentioning in the chat, we definitely feel this is all about collaboration and learning from each other. And we would not say that we are the experts and we have exactly what is prescribed, prescriptive solutions. But it's about a journey together and learning from each other. And you guys have definitely added to that today, and I just really appreciate it.
Thanks. I'd like to jump in and say a couple things, if that's all right. This was awesome, and I alluded to something that I'm working on in the chat a few times. I want to just share that out a little bit. So Alex is actually speaking at an event that I am co-producing called Shift 2021. I'll put the link in the chat in a minute, about doing a workshop with B Lab about regenerative business models, as part of one of 40 sessions over 3 days in mid-April. The event itself, I think, by design, has some regenerative principles into it. It was created by me and my team last spring as a response to COVID-19, as a way for social impact organizations to not have to collectively produce dozens of new virtual conferences, not knowing how to do that at scale. We've been doing marketing for conferences for a long time. My father co-founded a vegan and mindfulness conference 20 years ago that I've been marketing since the beginning, since I was in college. And so based on that, I landed work with SOCAP, leading their marketing for 5 years. I did the marketing for the first Regen conference that Kevin Jones and others created, Seeds, B Lab, Conscious Company Media, Social Venture Circle. I've been involved in marketing their conferences for the last 7 years. So this event brings together a lot of those organizations. They're each producing between 3 and 10% of the content, and then they're marketing it, and then they're getting 70% of any revenue that they generate, and we're taking 30%. So we're basically taking a small piece of the pie to produce it and giving back most of the revenue back to the partners, of which there are now over 90 involved. And I've been personally recruiting those myself, and with help from friends and colleagues to make the event successful. So right now we have about 250 people signed up, and expect another 200 to 300 to sign up in the next 2 weeks. Plus there's a bunch of speakers and guests from the speakers coming in as well. So there should be 500 to 700 people at the event. And hopefully it'll grow next year. We've had a lot of late conversations with partners that can't really get involved or things like that. Yeah, so Alex just shared the link. I can share a special discount code. If you use JB30, you'll get 30% off, which is the lowest available public price. But if you're LGBTQ, BIPOC, or otherwise have financial restrictions, you can use the second code, which is 70% off. We have an equity program that we co-designed with B-Lab for that. So those two codes are available and they won't expire. But we do have a ticket price on increase on Friday. It'll go up about 20% after Friday. So we have a deadline.
Awesome. Thanks, Justin. We're really excited about that event. Definitely encourage everybody to check it out. Is it okay, Justin, if we send the coupon codes to people who signed up for today's webinar, or would you prefer?
Sure, that's fine. Yeah, absolutely. And you already have the broader partner content I shared with you a couple of days ago.
Yeah, totally. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just give a shout out to a couple of other things if anyone's interested in learning more, but I did want to share our foundations course. We have a live version coming up in 2 weeks if anyone wants to join that, or we have it available on demand to watch at your own pace. So if you want to learn more about InRhythm's framework, about design principles, recommend checking that out. And then if you are ready to design something in a different way, taking this approach, you can enroll in the design lab. We have an early bird discount that's ending today. And I included the coupon code there. So we can include all this in an email if anyone would like. Just wanted to share a little bit about that too. So thanks for the opportunity to do that. Yeah, and with that, I think we are almost at time. Thank you all. I guess I'll just say get in touch if anyone wants to chat further. I mean, we love connecting with folks. We'd love to have the time to learn about each of you here, but if you want to just schedule a conversation to connect and exchange and learn more about each other, we'd love that. So Jen,
Yeah, thanks again. And I would say kind of the same thing that Justin alluded to, like, don't let money be a barrier for continuing learning and, to work on this together in your own context. And we'd love to hear more about that. So reach out to us. So.
I'm just curious, before you end, what is the best way to connect with you when you say reach out to us?
Well, our marketing person, Tracy, that's on here, she would love if we gave a shout out, said, follow us on Instagram, Facebook.
Tracy.
I know you have my number, so.
I do. Okay.
And yes, you can follow us on Instagram too, and direct message. We watch we will respond that way too.
Yes, and Michelle or anyone else, Alex posted, you can email me at jen@inrhythm.co, not .com, .co. So.
Yes, don't. And InRhythm can be hard to spell, so be careful.
Yes.
We are still learning how to spell it. Okay. It's evolving, yeah. Thank you all for choosing to spend your day with us.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Cheers. Everyone.
I'm just reading Justin's comment before I hop off.
Yeah.
Yeah, Eddie asked me to privately about how my business was regenerative, and we're wrapping up. People can leave, but I'll just share. I shared this earlier. I was homeschooled for Montessori for several years, and I was homeschooled for several years before starting public school. And I do think that had some impact on my mindset. My parents were both. My father was he manufactured fermented foods, so it was like his whole business model was like continuing to use the same product to create generations of food. But my business, I've never taken